Hi, my name is Andrew, and welcome to Our Last Meal. This is a podcast where I talk with guests about grief and loss, framed around meals that they've shared with someone meaningful in their life. Each episode, I'm going to have conversations with people about their experiences with losing loved ones, and we'll dive into who they were, how they've impacted their lives, and what was their final meal together like. This first episode is going to be a pilot where I take you through a little more about who I am and where loss has played a part of my life. I know what you may be thinking. Why am I talking about grief through meals and food? For me, part of it is that I've always considered myself kind of a foodie. And I want to explain because I know that that can come off as pretentious and kind of douchey. I love food. Everything from a gas station hot dog to a high end steak, and really anywhere in between. I love food. The only thing that makes it better, though, than just good food is who you're spending it with, who you're enjoying that meal with. Whether it's your friends, your family, a significant other, good food is made great by the company, not just the ingredients. Honestly, one of the best meals that I can think of recently that I've had was at this small Greek restaurant near my house with my wife and my daughter. The food was great. We had everything from lamb and chicken kebabs to tzatziki, fresh warm pita. But when I think about that day, that meal, it's not just the food. The food is really an anchoring point for this great memory with my two favorite people in the world. We spent the day shopping at a local farmer's market. We walked through an antique store. We walked around this downtown area. I had a chance to buy this old Conway Twitty album on vinyl. And I realize as I say that, the vinyl record purchase plus the foodie comment probably does make me seem like a bit of a pretentious douche. But I hope as you get to know me, you'll realize that's not exactly the case. So I mentioned that this show is going to have to do with grief and loss. That's something I've had to deal with a lot more in the last year. And for clarity, I'm recording this May of 2022. In late 2019, my grandmother started having a lot of health issues. A lot of natural things that come along with growing older, but things that are still really difficult for the people around you, the people that love you. To top it all off, she and my grandfather both caught COVID and were hospitalized in 2020. For a time, things were looking really tough, and we were all bracing for the worst. As morbid as this sounds, there was this feeling in our family that the time that we had left with her was short. Thankfully, COVID didn't kill either one of my grandparents. They were both released from the hospital, and while there was some cautious optimism, there was still a lot of concern for this frail 87-year-old woman. My grandfather, 2 years younger than her, took over as her primary caregiver. Just as an aside, I've just got to say that it's incredible that after 60 plus years of marriage, these two still loved each other very much. My grandmother, this woman who'd cared for six kids, more grandkids than I'm going to count as I sit here, great grandkids, she was now the one who needed looking after, and my grandfather stepped right into that role. Men of this generation often get a lot of crap for being misogynistic and backwards, and I'll be the first to admit that's often for very good cause. But hats off to him because his wife needed him and he stepped up without ever complaining. His number one priority was making sure that she was okay and taken care of. I just have to say that I consider the two of them to be great role models when it comes to love and marriage, and that's the same kind of energy that I try to bring to my relationship with my wife. I've told her a bunch of times now the goal is at least 60 years. So a little background on my family. My parents, siblings, and myself moved away from my extended family when I was about 6 years old. So visiting my grandparents' house was always a special occasion. Growing up, I always looked forward to running around with my cousins, exploring the neighborhood of my grandparents' house. These are always fun times, but the central meeting place was always the kitchen table. My grandmother was an incredible cook, and even now in my 30s, I look back so fondly on the meals that she used to make us. There was a lot of simple, classic Southern food made with love. And Crisco. There's definitely a lot of Crisco. My favorite thing that she made, though, and something I've never been able to quite replicate, were these hoe cakes, this fried cornbread that's just so good. I'm also going to mention biscuits, too. And while I'm sitting here talking to you now, I don't know that there was ever a single meal I ate at my grandmother's table that didn't have at least a tray of biscuits or that fried cornbread. It was as much a part of dinner as watching old reruns of Andy Griffith on TV. And I'm painfully aware that this just sounds like this cliched caricature of a Southern family, but I swear to God, this was as natural to us as it was breathing growing up. As an adult now, I'm often thinking back of that week every summer of my childhood I'd spend at my grandparents' house, and those days I'd get to hang out with my cousins, and all the food that my grandma kept on hand to feed us. There were these little Debbie donut sticks. We would inhale them as kids. Every once in a while, as an adult now, I have to pick one up to eat it just for the nostalgia kick. They're just so sweet now I can barely eat them. There are plain bologna sandwiches with mustard on white bread, the most absolutely basic thing possible, but it's something that I still love and crave. And just one salty, tangy, processed bite of that makes me a fourth grader again. There are also these Mama Rose's pizzas. It was this brand sold specifically in the meat department of the grocery store, and honestly, they weren't that great. But if I were to take a bite of one of those right now, I'm 12 years old again. I'm sitting at my grandmother's kitchen table with my cousins. I'm going to always love Mama Rose's pizza because the sheer thought of them has my grandmother's voice ringing in my head. And one of the things that I learned in the writing and production of this podcast is that Mama Rose's pizzas have actually been discontinued due to COVID. And I cannot fully express to you how disappointing that is for me, this loss of this mid quality frozen pizza. But I must digress. There are two meals that stand out to me in the story when I think about last meals. The first was about 8 years ago when I was traveling for work and spending a week close to my grandparents' town. I wanted to visit them and spend time with them, so we made plans for me to come have dinner with them one night. I know that they were excited to see me, and I was excited to see them. I also know that my grandmother was happy for that chance to cook for her grandson again. There's something really disorienting about returning to your childhood as an adult. When I pulled into the driveway, there's a part of me that was expecting to find my cousins inside waiting for me to come play before my entire extended family ate dinner together. A combination of this beef stew that my grandmother was really known for and taught my sister to make. These fresh greens that were always so good. Biscuits, sweet tea, just organized chaos. That's not what I found though. You never find your memories in one piece when you try to step back in time. I wasn't a little boy anymore. I was a grown man with a job, a fiance, and proudly a brand new mid-sized Kia. My grandparents were still my grandparents, but they'd slowed down. This was before the day that my grandmother was home alone and fell, shattering her wrist. She sat for hours waiting for my grandfather to get home because she didn't want to bother anyone. The meal I ate with my grandparents that night was chicken baked in Italian salad dressing and under-seasoned mixed vegetables. This is a far cry from the meals that I've had in the past. I also want you to understand, though, I'm not complaining. I still look back on that dinner fondly because it was a meal that my grandmother planned in advance and prepared because she knew that I was coming to visit, and it was a chance to sit down with them and talk. Talk with two people who'd been instrumental in my childhood, but talk to them not as a child with an adult, but as an adult. And I don't care how corny it sounds, that meal was made with love, and it was wonderful. We ate, we spent time talking and reminiscing, but honestly, I couldn't tell you what the conversation was about specifically. I can just tell you how good it felt to sit down with them and talk, catch up on what they were doing, tell them about my life, about work, about the girl I met who was going to become my wife. I left their home that night, the home I'd eaten a bunch of meals in, countless meals throughout my life. I felt nourished. My stomach, my soul, my heart. It was a good feeling. The second meal that stands out came about 7 years later. The meal itself won't sound like much. It was just lunch from McDonald's, but there are several things that made it one of the most cherished meals of my life. The visit came from a fear of my grandmother's declining health. My mother warned me that we didn't know how much time was left. There's this combination of decades of type 1 diabetes, what we now know were early signs of dementia, and many other health issues that you could expect in your late 80s. I brought my daughter, who was 3.5 at the time, with me. I wanted to get these three different generations together so that we could spend time together, and honestly, so that I could burn it into my brain. My daughter loves spending time with her great grandparents. She spent time playing with toys collected over decades, and played with by who knows how many grandchildren and great grandchildren. My grandparents enjoyed spending time with her. When lunchtime rolled around that day, I volunteered to take care of it. And it may sound silly, but the thing is, I wanted to repay them back in some small way for every time they'd ever fed me and taken care of me. They were never ones to be fussed over, so they insisted that McDonald's was fine, so my daughter and I picked it up. We all ate together and spent more time together before we left to drive a few hours back home. It's a really weird feeling going to visit someone because they're in poor health. There's this feeling that hangs over you the entire time that this may be it. And it creates this pressure that you have to make memories or make sure that you're making it count. And I'm not really sure how you do that. It's almost like a stress that comes from inside of you of, am I really in the moment right now? Am I going to remember this? Even now, I don't remember the conversation. I have no clue what we talked about, but I do have these mental images of my grandmother playing with my daughter while they sat on the couch. I remember my daughter's face lighting up whenever her great grandfather told her he had something special for her and came back from his room with a silver half dollar. The look on her face and the fact that she still has it now a few years later. I'm incredibly fortunate that I've got photos and videos of them all together, and I feel good that after 30 plus years of life and countless meals that they provided me, I was able to at least pay it back in some small part. I was afraid whenever I left that day that it was going to be the last time I'd ever see my grandmother and the last time I'd ever share a meal with both of my grandparents. I was partially right. I told you earlier that my grandparents both caught COVID in 2020 and they were both hospitalized. I told you that there was a sense of fear that this was it. An already ill elderly woman catching a serious illness. I remember telling my wife multiple times before they were diagnosed that if they caught it, I just didn't see how my grandmother could possibly survive. Somehow, though, miraculously, they both left the hospital and went home. It was touch and go. We were all scared. They were in their late 80s, but we were at least hopeful. They returned home, and my grandfather resumed taking care of her. They were both strong. She's still really strong. In early 2021, my grandfather was diagnosed with an aggressive form of cancer. I honestly don't remember the kind. It was a lot of syllables, and honestly, the word cancer was the only one that really stood out to me, and it's the only one that I felt like was worth focusing on. Tests were conducted, doctors were consulted, and it all came down to one word: terminal. If you've ever lost a loved one to cancer, especially if it was a short battle, then you know that time doesn't make sense anymore. You learn that 4 months is simultaneously the blink of an eye and an eternity. 4 months is all it took to take his life. It felt like such a short battle, but watching his suffering showed the time stood still. The suffering felt like it was dragging on, but it also felt like the amount of time from he's not feeling well to he has cancer to you need to come to town now because we're about to lose him. It happened in the blink of an eye. He passed away at home in the middle of the night, May 19th, 2021. My family gathered for the funeral, and the man in the casket didn't look like him. He'd lost so much weight in such a short amount of time that at first I wasn't really sure it was him. He was missing this characteristic smirk. It was part mischief, part kindness. We laid him to rest, and the whole time my grandmother was lying in a hospital. She was unable to attend because of a new health issue. The service was beautiful, though. We told stories about his irreverent sense of humor, his goodwill, his compassion and charity for others. Things like anonymous donations and groceries dropped off on people's doorsteps. We echoed this common refrain that he'd always say, "If you need me, I'll call you." His tongue in cheek half joke, half serious motto that he'd always used, and it became the unofficial motto of the funeral that day. There were a lot of smiles, a lot of tears, a lot of laughs. I love my grandfather, and I miss him every day. I still get reminded by my granddaughter. I miss Pawpaw. AJ was a good man. I remember updating him on progress in my life as I grew up and got myself together. I remember getting affirmations from him when I was on the right path, that I was working hard, I was saving money, when I was meeting the right girl, focusing on my family. I still need him sometimes. Still need him for reinforcement, for encouragement, just to tell him I love him. Only thing I can say is that thankfully he's still there. He's in my head, ready to call. Still hear his voice, clear as crystal every time. Andrew? If you made it this far, I just want to thank you for taking the time to listen to our Last Meal Pod. Gonna have a couple of housekeeping things at the end, but first, before I do that, I just want to, as a postscript, talk a little bit about some dishes that my grandfather was really known for. These are a couple North Carolina classics. That's where we're from. The first one was pulled or chopped barbecue pork. If you like barbecue, you may be aware that there are several styles. In the Carolinas, pork is king. So he actually had large smokers that he'd welded together himself, and from time to time he would smoke whole pork shoulders, and then he would either shred or chop those. And honestly, it's one of those things that if you've never tried the real version, and I am firmly in the camp that good barbecue is about the meat. It's not about the sauce. It's just about meat that is cooked slowly with smoke and patience. Please do yourself a favor and seek this out. Try it. It is just phenomenal, out of this world. The other thing he was really known for is Brunswick stew. It's a traditional Southern dish. It's a tomato base, usually with local vegetables and meat. A lot of times, the pork he would cook would go into that Brunswick stew, and he would occasionally, once a year or so, just do a giant Brunswick stew cook. States of North Carolina, Georgia, and Virginia, they all claim to be the originator of this. Honestly, my humble opinion, doesn't really matter where it comes from. It's just phenomenal. If you've got a grandfather or a loved one who makes it, probably that's the best way to get it. I'm going to try and link some recipes on the website, and I would just encourage you, just go out of your way. The next time there's a chill in the air, or if you just need a bowl of comfort food, I cannot recommend Brunswick stew highly enough. Even something canned from the grocery store, if it's not the best, it's still going to be probably pretty good. So please look into that. Thank you everyone for listening. That's it for the pilot episode of Our Last Meal. My plans for the future are going to involve talking to guests. I'm always going to be interested to hear from people. So if you think you've got a story, or if you've just got somebody you want to talk about, somebody that meant a lot to you, and just share who that person was and what the relationship was around food, and just how that was a part of that relationship, how that built that, please let me know. Visit ourlastmeal.com. That's the website. It's going to be constantly a work in progress. You also can email ourlastmealpod@gmail.com, or find me on Instagram or Twitter at ourlastmealpod. As far as format goes, I really want these to be conversational. I feel like this is a chance to kind of talk through grief. It's something that's really difficult to discuss, but I view this podcast as a way to kind of memorialize and speak the name of the people that you care about. And I'll say too, it's not something I view as just death of a loved one. There are relationships that end, friendships, all kinds of different relationships that you've had in your life that ends one way or another. And sometimes you just want to talk about that. So I'm really interested to talk with people and just hear their story and allow them a chance to speak about that. So again, reach out. I hope you enjoyed this. Please, rate and review whatever podcast service you listen to. Any feedback is good, but I appreciate it, and I will talk to you next time.